We're now looking at diets of walleye using some novel genetics approaches to try to figure out if they're preying on young yellow perch when they're small larvae or young juveniles. And then the other thing that's sort of supporting all of this is that the other prey fish in the lake, things like gizzard shad, emerald shiner, spot-tail shiners, these soft-raised species that don't have these sharp fin spines, they're all at really low abundance. And I think now walleye, because they're so abundant, they may be competing with themselves. They've eliminated the prey they would like to feed on, and now we're turning to yellow perch. So this is the leading hypothesis here that we're exploring.
From the heart of The Ohio State University on the Oval, this is Voices of Excellence from the College of Arts and Sciences, with your host, David Staley. Voices focuses on the innovative work of arts and sciences faculty and staff, with departments as wide-ranging as art, astronomy, chemistry and biochemistry, physics, emergent materials, and mathematics and languages, among many others. The college always has something exciting happening. Join us to find out what's new now.
I'm joined this morning by Stuart Ludsin, professor in the Department of Evolution, Ecology, and Organismal Biology at The Ohio State University College of the Arts and Sciences. He is the co-director of the Aquatic Ecology Laboratory and director of fish management with the Ohio Division of Wildlife of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. And I want to find out more about that relationship this morning. Dr. Ludsin, welcome to Voices.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
I'm interested to know about your relationship with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. How did that come about?
That partnership came about from the time I was a graduate student here, which was back in the late 90s. My former PhD advisor actually developed this partnership with the Ohio Department of Natural Resources Division of Wildlife, created this wonderful lab in which I did my PhD. I finished up my PhD, went to work for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, a federal agency up in the state up north. When he retired back in the early 2000s, mid-2000s, he asked me to apply for a job here at Ohio State. And part of it was managing that partnership that he set up. And so I walked into what I'm going to call as a well-oiled machine. I think I've refined a few things over the years. But that partnership was one of the things that attracted me to come back to Ohio State, actually. It's a unique university-state partnership that is pretty rare around the country, and it's one in which I think that a lot of other states are trying to emulate now. And so it's ultimately what got me here, and it's been fun.
What's the nature of the partnership? What is it that you provide to the ODNR?
So there's a federal excise tax on anything related to fishing. So if people go out and buy boat gas or buy fishing lures or fishing rods, there's a congressional act, the Dingell-Johnson Act, and then there's also a Wallop-Rowe Act that have been passed that basically charge a tax for any of those purchases. That money comes back to support the resource. So in this case, helping increase fishing opportunities around the United States. The state of Ohio gets in money from this federal tax and needs to have a match from non-federal dollars to be able to use that money. And so Ohio State provides that match to allow those money to be used for research. And so my position in my lab is more or less what we call the experimental research arm of the Ohio Division of Wildlife. And so we get in $1.5 million a year to do research with. That $1.5 million supports all sorts of personnel that kind of help manage this partnership. It pays bills, maintenance of boats, etc. But a lot of it is used to do research that the state might not have the expertise to do. And that's my role.
Well, and you called these sorts of partnerships rare. What explains that?
For many state agencies, they can find other means besides the university to make match. So the state itself might have money, and so they hire their own research scientists to do that work. So in states like Michigan and Wisconsin, as an example, there's a lot more state-funded researchers that might be adjunct with the university. But in Ohio, they tend to come to Ohio State and other universities as well to get the work done. And in many cases, what happens is if I can't do the work myself or my colleagues, we have a great set of colleagues in the Aquatic Ecology Laboratory here at Ohio State. If there are things we can't do or don't have the expertise, we'll use that money and subcontract out to other state institutions to take advantage of research expertise over there. So it's just a matter of how rich the state is in terms of money and how much investment they put into their own research staff.
You said you worked at NOAA. What sort of work were you doing with that agency?
So when I was with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, I was in a position called a research fisheries biologist. So I was actually doing very similar work to what I'm doing now. The caveat being that I was a little bit more constrained in what I can do. When you work for the federal government, over the years there's been sort of creep to not just do research, but to do research that has an immediate benefit to society. So I tend to do what we call fundamental or basic research. I try to understand how natural systems work, such as lakes and rivers. And then I take that understanding and apply it to, in this case, fisheries management problems. And so at NOAA, I was doing research that was primarily there to help management agencies understand their fisheries and help make decisions that might affect water quality. And so I do very similar kinds of things over here. It's just I have a little bit more freedom in terms of the types of questions I ask, as well as the places I can get grant money from. So as a NOAA scientist, I was never able to go after National Science Foundation dollars, as an example. So, and that's not the case here.
Well, I want to talk about some of the research that you're doing right now. And I want to start with the work you're doing trying to understand the declining catch rates of yellow perch in Lake Erie. What's the issue? What's the problem you're addressing?
Yeah, so yellow perch is a native species. It's of what I'll call cultural, ecological, and economic importance. It supports major recreational or sport fisheries. On the U.S. side, it supports major commercial fisheries on both the U.S. and Canadian side. And this is a very abundant species of fish that has been declining in the central basin of Lake Erie. So that's the part of the lake above Cleveland. And then in the western basin, which is north of Toledo, if you think about where Toledo and Sandusky are, that northern part of the lake, that basin also has been declining of late, we're just realizing, but catch rates have been declining for quite some time for especially recreational fishermen and anglers, and that's of concern for the state of Ohio. Given these declines and the importance of fishing and attracts tourists, the Ohio Division of Wildlife and other state agencies have been really trying to figure out why these catch rates have been declining. And that's where they come to me to hire good graduate students to figure out what's going on there, with the hope that we can identify ways to rehabilitate these populations if possible. At the minimum, a lot of what I do is trying to help the Division of Wildlife understand whether or not we can expect yellow perch to recover. That may not be possible in some cases because of things humans are doing to the ecosystem. The hope is, though, that we'll find the smoking gun, and there may be ways, we'll call a management lever that can be pulled that the Division of Wildlife can use to kind of rehabilitate these fisheries.
Have you found the smoking gun?
We have not.
Any candidates
Yes.
or suspects?
Yeah, so 100% we have suspects. And so I've got 2 PhD students and a former master student who's been working heavily on these problems. In the case of the western part of the lake, we think reduced catch rates may be linked to an invasive species called Bythotrephes longimanus. It's a spiny water flea. It came over from the Baltic Caspian region. It's a zooplankton species, so a microscopic organism that actually is pretty visible by the eye. It's about half an inch long. It's got a huge spine on it, and it came over ships in order to stabilize and regulate buoyancy, take on water from their home origin to travel across the Atlantic Ocean, come into the U.S., dump their ballast, this water from their home port into places like the Great Lakes. That allowed for the establishment of Bythotrephes. This species is something yellow perch loves to eat. And so there's 2 ways in which we think Bythotrephes might be negatively affecting catch rates by recreational anglers. One way is that if you've got this food source out and available in the environment when you're going to fish, and that food source, in this case Bythotrephes, is in high abundance, you can almost view it as the Bythotrephes are competing for the attention of the fish with anglers' lures. And so if you got this smorgasbord of invasive species that are pretty conspicuous, they have a very large, dark eye spot that makes them pretty conspicuous in the water column, Yellow perch gorge themselves on this invasive
So I'm not interested in your worm.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a lot easier to just eat a ton of these little bithytrophes that might be in the water columns. That's one reason. We see catch rates declining when bithytrophes are in high
So
abundance.
the number of fish aren't declining, just our ability to catch them.
If you would have asked me, if I went to a meeting last week, I would have said yes, the number of fish in western Lake Erie has been a stable population. I went to a Lake Erie committee meeting last week, and it appears that there's actually a decline in the fishery in the western basin. So what I'm going to say, if caught me a week ago, I would have said, yes, stable population. But there's now some evidence to suggest that there might have been some historical overfishing in the lake. And it's a hypothesis that the agencies and I are trying to figure out. But we definitely see a negative relationship with bithytrophes. So even if the population had been declining, part of the reason it could be declining could be linked to this bithytrophes. Because the other part about this invasive species is it's got a long spine on it with a bunch of barbs. So you can think about the kind of barbs like on a barbed wire fence. Mm-hmm. When a fish eats a lot of these bithytrophes, those barbs get entangled in their gut, and they take a very long time to digest. And so there is some concern that, and we've seen this with other species of fish, that when you get a mass of these spines locked up in the gut of, in this case, let's call it yellow perch, there's the possibility that they can't feed as well, or they might not feel hungry and then therefore might not want to also fish. And so we're trying to understand now the ecological consequences of these bithytrophes themselves. They may inhibit foraging, feeding of these fish. So, and in the central basin, the leading candidate right now appears to be a very large walleye population. So walleye is another native species, supports big commercial and recreational fisheries. Walleye have been doing exceptionally well since about 2015 for reasons that we don't fully understand, but it might be an artifact of nutrient pollution to the lake, which I can come back to and chat about if you like. But a very large walleye population, probably the largest in the history of the lake, is out there. There's a lot of evidence in the central part of the lake suggests that walleye might be feeding on yellow perch. And so you get this little trade-off by having one big top predator in the case of walleye that may be having a negative effect on another important fish, yellow perch. And so I have a PhD student, David Drinko, who's digging into that right now.
Has that been foreseen? Or?
It was not foreseen. So historically, we don't ever think about walleye eating yellow perch in Lake Erie. Yellow perch is a common prey of walleye in other ecosystems, but in Lake Erie there are so many other species of forage or prey fish out there that walleye wouldn't need to eat yellow perch. Yellow perch have these spines on the back associated with their fins on their backside that make it a harder species of fish to eat than maybe a small shiner or a rainbow smelt that doesn't have any spines at all. And so one of the things that I'm working on right now with my students is there a linkage between walleye and yellow perch? All the statistical modeling we've done show a very clear negative relationship between the amount of walleye in the lake and yellow perch catches in the last decade. And we've had very low catches of yellow perch of late with what we call recruitment. Annual production events of young have been basically virtually eliminated and are below average in the central basin. We're now looking at diets of walleye using some novel genetics approaches to try to figure out if they're preying on young yellow perch when they're small larvae or young juveniles. And then the other thing that's sort of supporting all of this is that the other prey fish in the lake, things like gizzard shad, emerald shiner, spot-tail shiners, these soft-raised species that don't have these sharp fin spines, they're all at really low abundance. And I think now walleye, because they're so abundant, they may be competing with themselves. They've eliminated the prey they would like to feed on, and now we're turning to yellow perch. So this is the leading hypothesis there that we're exploring.
You've described a surprising paradox in your research. Cleaning up the water can actually hurt some fish. Now, that sounds counterintuitive to me.
Yes. Cleaning up the lake, unfortunately, is needed because we have what we call non-point source nutrient pollution happening now. So runoff of water that have sediments and nutrients from agricultural landscapes, go into tributaries that eventually drain into Lake Erie. When those nutrients and sediments that have nutrients attached to them get into the lake, it leads to water quality impairments like harmful algal blooms. So these are nuisance algae that can have toxins, and it's these toxins that led to the drinking water crisis in Toledo back in 2014.
That's right. There was like an enormous bloom. It was like it seemed like almost a third of Lake Erie.
Yeah, there's been huge blooms of late. There's no doubt there's been more harmful algal blooms in the last 20 years relative to the time before that. In the case of the Toledo water crisis, what caused that exact event wasn't necessarily the magnitude of the bloom, but a very toxic part of that bloom got above the intake, and the city managers were not prepared for that toxin to be lingering above the intake, and that's what led it to get into the drinking water supply. So that water quality impairment in the West Basin and in the Central Basin is called a dead zone. So it's low oxygen zones that occur in the bottom parts of lakes is another impairment that's linked to agricultural runoff of nutrients. So there's been a lot of effort to cut back on nutrient loading into Lake Erie, make cuts by about 40% as a means to clean up the lake so that we can take care of these water quality impairments, which are thought to hurt species like fish in the lake. They also make the lake look like pea soup, and nobody wants to swim when it's pea soup out there. So one of the things that my colleagues and I have found, and I'm just going to put a shout out to James St. Clair, who's a postdoc who led a lot of that research, we found that when you reduce nutrients into the lake, looking back at a century of historical records, if we create an index of what we call lake productivity, going back to the early 1900s, which is a measure of how much nutrients are at the base of the food web and fueling the system, we see that different species of fish respond differently to the amount of nutrients or productivity in the lake. So a species like lake whitefish, which is a commercially caught fish, tastes really good, is a species that really likes clean water. So when you clean up nutrients and you get rid of harmful algal blooms and you get rid of bottom hypoxia, lake whitefish does wonderfully. So as you said earlier, this is what you would expect. But species like yellow perch in particular, and to a lesser degree walleye, get hurt when you cut back on nutrient loading into the lake. The food production that comes from the nutrients, when you have lots of nutrients coming into the lake, they feed microscopic organisms like algae and eventually zooplankton that can feed the young of yellow perch and walleye. And when you cut off that or reduce that energy at the base of the food web, you get less production of those species of fish. What we think is happening is reducing nutrients is creating a wicked management landscape for agencies. On one hand, you get clean water and you might get whitefish doing well. On the other hand, by cleaning up the lake, some of the contemporary fisheries that are doing well in this sort of degraded Lake Erie ecosystem, like walleye and yellow perch, may do less well. And so you get these trade-offs that are occurring.
So what is to be done?
Well, that's the hard part. I just do the science to help agencies make those decisions. The reality is agencies themselves have to make a hard decision, and that in part means trying to understand what their stakeholders want. So I think agencies like the Ohio Division of Wildlife, their goal is to increase fishing opportunities around the state, make their constituents, which might be recreational anglers, could be commercial netters, happy. And so in the end, there is no easy answer. What I do know is that decision making is going to be made in consensus between the state and with stakeholder input. But I'm not a part of that decision. I just get to provide the information to help let them know that there's a potential trade-off out there.
Well, I know another area of interest in your research is ecosystem-based management, and maybe start with a definition of what this is.
So we think about an ecosystem, it's all the physical, chemical, biological factors, zooplankton, algae, fish in the ecosystem, the nutrients coming in, climate, things like temperature, precipitation, etc. So it's the environment itself and all the biological factors as an ecosystem. The things that I am trying to get fisheries management agencies to appreciate is the need to care about the broader ecosystem, these broader chemical, biological, and physical factors in the environment, and think about them as they make management decision making. So it's basically thinking about not just the fishery itself, but thinking about the environment and the broader ecosystem in which that fish population that supports the fisheries lives. And so major stressors, things like climate change, invasive species, nutrient pollution, or cleaning up nutrient pollution, are all things that alter the environment and habitat that might support fish. And so it's basically just getting agencies to not just think about managing how many adults are in the lake to be potentially reproducing, but thinking about the habitat itself and the ability to support the adults in their decision making. And so one of the things that doesn't happen very often, especially in the Great Lakes, but very often in many places, is building models that think about broader change in the ecosystem when trying to forecast how many yellow perch might be there in the future. And so if you have a stressor like climate change or a new invasive species that's completely changing the system, you may have a situation where the ecological understanding that we have, our understanding of what's driving yellow perch or what's driving production of walleye, for example, there may be a fundamental shift in the ecosystem that comes with these big stressors that may limit the ability of that system to support that fishery, period. And in some cases, you may get a situation where the ecosystem changes, alters habitat for fish, where you may get a boost in production for some species of fish, and that's what we think is happening with nutrient pollution, helping walleye and yellow perch. In other cases, if you have a change in the environment, a drastically different climate regime, it may lead to an inability to support a particular fishery. And so it's thinking more broadly than just about catches of fish and managing the fishery itself.
In your career, you worked at NOAA, you work now with ODNR. What's it like trying to get scientists and government agencies to work together? Have you learned any lessons from this?
Have I learned any lessons? So the answer is I've had a wonderful working relationship with pretty much all the agencies that I've been involved with, but it's not always the easiest relationship. There are definitely oftentimes differences in opinion in terms of how to approach a problem. Sometimes there's practical limitations that I may be unaware of because of public perception that I have to be careful about what I sometimes and how I approach my science. In other cases, a good part of my job is educating management agencies on the science I do and trying to get them to understand why I want to take a particular approach or don't want to take a particular approach. The Ohio Division of Wildlife has been a wonderful agency to work with. They're sharing of data that can help me in my research. They offer in-kind support. Personnel come out and work with us collaboratively on our projects. The one thing that's probably the most challenging, but also is most rewarding as well. So if I write a National Science Foundation grant, I'll just give you an example here. If I write a National Science Foundation grant, I put a lot of time and energy to write the best grant possible. We have to do all the pre-planning up front. And then if the money comes in, then guardrails are not completely taken off. We have to write annual reports and account. But I do my research and nobody else weighs in on my research. With the Division of Wildlife, it's a true partnership. So they come to me often with a problem. Yellow perch on Lake Erie, it's declining. What's going on? Please help us. We collectively work together to collaborate to develop a project that can help address their concerns. And so I start from scratch with, okay, we got to fix yellow perch, for example, help figure out what's going on there. I bring in a graduate student. We have lots of meetings and back and forth conversations about how we might approach this project. And so sometimes it's wonderful and they like what I want to do and they're all on board. And other times they're like, no, I don't get the purpose of that. And I think, what about doing this and this and this? So sometimes you can have the situation where there's too many cooks in the kitchen and it can be frustrating. And especially because there's some interesting science questions that I want to answer sometimes or my students want to answer, but they may be a little bit removed from the applied fisheries part of it. So there's a little bit of a give and take. They give me some leeway to do some additional, I'll call it fun science, basic science, in order to be able to answer their question. But despite sometimes some headaches and some tough conversations. It's a great partnership, and the benefits far outweigh the costs, and we get a better product out of that, and the agencies get a better product out of that. Division of Wildlife, because they're involved, they can ensure that the money they're spending on us is getting used appropriately to answer their questions.
We often read in the media that there's a distrust in expertise now, but it sounds as though ODNR trusts your expertise.
I'm a little frustrated as a faculty member and a scientist with some of the anti-environment, anti-university language you hear in the news, but the Division of Wildlife, as far as I can tell, is very happy with this partnership, and they do put a lot of trust into us. And likewise, I put a lot of trust and faith into them, and that's why it's a true partnership. We can have hard conversations, and it is a giant give and take, but it works out really well. And that's one of the reasons I was excited to come here.
So why are you an ecologist? Did you know when you were 4 years old you were going to be an ecologist? Were you a fisherman growing up?
I absolutely did not have any clue I'd be doing what I'm doing today. I was born in Cleveland. I did live in Florida for a period of time, and I did fish quite a bit. We had a canal behind our house. Came back to Cleveland when I was in second grade, and I did not fish at all for most of my childhood because I grew up in a suburban area. My dad didn't and mom didn't fish. I went to college at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, to become a doctor. I majored in zoology. It was pre-med, and it was very, very much happenstance and serendipity that I am in the profession I am. So during my junior year at Miami, I needed to do some undergraduate research to write a thesis to be able to graduate. I must have missed at that time. There were very few emails out going around at that time, but I did not know I needed to sign up. And the only lab that was looking for help was a guy who actually got his PhD here at Ohio State, Jeff Miner, who was looking for an undergraduate researcher to help him do some behavioral experiments with fish. I knew nothing about ecology. I knew nothing about behavioral ecology. I had a fish tank growing up, and I was like, well, I needed the hours, and ended up working for him, conducting these experiments. He took me under his wing, taught me a ton. I took simultaneously an ecology class as part of the major. That opened up my interest in the field, and then apparently I did a good enough job that Jeff allowed me to go to Sweden with him and work as a research technician between my junior and senior years at Miami. And every day I was in the field with him and another PhD level scientists, talking science, manipulating these ponds. We were doing these really cool experiments with ponds. We were cutting them in half, adding predators to half the pond or removing predators and looking at the effects. That experience was awesome. And I stopped studying for the MCATs and started studying for the GREs. And next thing I know, I just fell in love with research and progressed along that continuum until I got my PhD, and here I am.
But you had no intention of being an academic, I think you said. It was to be a research scientist.
That's right. When I graduated with my PhD in 2000 from here, I wanted nothing to do with academia. My PhD advisor, Roy Stein, who was an amazing advisor and somebody I talked to quite frequently, I didn't want his job. He worked way too hard. He seemed constantly stressed, and I wanted anything but that. I loved doing the research, and that's why I ended up going into working for NOAA. When I was with NOAA, what I learned as I was doing a good job there and working more than 40 hours a week, and I felt like I was doing enough that I should be getting a promotion and a raise. And my director at that time said, well, the only way you can really make that happen quickly is to apply for other jobs and get competing offers. At that time, I was there about 5 years. My PhD advisor, Roy, was contemplating retirement. He said, you should apply for this position. I think you'd be pretty good at it. And so I applied, partly out of respect for him and partly as a means to get a promotion at NOAA, and came down and interviewed, and I did a good job, but more importantly, I loved the interview process. I loved being on the university. There was so much energy. And I was, at that time at NOAA, I was in my early 30s. I was the young postdoc there, surrounded by a bunch of old white men like I am right now, and going to a university environment really excited me. And I came back from that interview thinking, if I get this offer, I'm going to take this job. So that's what ended up happening. And then the other reason I was really excited to come to university was to teach. I really like research. I do like teaching a lot. Doing both of them is hard at times. But the teaching element for me allows me to educate the next generation of students and scientists. And part of what I do when I get into the classroom is try to give them tools to make informed decisions about what they see in the news. Help them separate what's fact from fiction so that they can make good decisions about the environment, which is something I care a lot about, and vote with at least not going into it, I'm going to call it ignorant. And so I felt by teaching, I can actually do more for protecting the environment and getting people interested in it than I could actually through my own research.
What are you working on now? What's next for your research?
So the biggest thing that I'm working on and most excited about is creating this, we'll call it a data sharing infrastructure, or a data sharing platform for the Great Lakes. So as a researcher, I spend a lot of time, way too much time, trying to secure data that can help me answer questions important to management on the Great Lakes. And currently, there's a ton of data around the Great Lakes. It's just housed in very disparate entities and very hard to access. So there's federal, state, provincial, private, non-governmental databases dispersed all over the Great Lakes. They're in different forms. And so this platform would provide not a new database, but actually literally a software infrastructure to link together all of these databases so that any user, any researcher could sit at a computer, look at a map, point on that map and say, I would like to know all the data that exists from this area. This infrastructure would dip into all these databases, bring it up into the cloud, where it can be manipulated with artificial intelligence. If they're not familiar with developing tools, they can use artificial intelligence to manipulate the data. We're going to develop tools up in the cloud that can be used as well, so that they can bring down data in the right, what we call spatial and temporal resolution, the right format, in a way that they can immediately use. And the goal is to save anybody who wants to do research months and months of time. So I think there'll be a big cost savings. And because caring about the broader ecosystem is important, by allowing all sorts of environmental data to be integrated and brought into one place, it'll support ecosystem science, and that gets back to what we talked about earlier. That can allow for then facilitate the use of ecosystem-based approaches in management so that we can understand what trade-offs might emerge in the future by cleaning up the water, as an example.
Stuart Ludsin, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciated the conversation.
Voices of Excellence is produced and recorded at The Ohio State University College of Arts and Sciences Marketing and Communications Studio. More information about the podcast and our guests can be found at go.osu.edu/voices. Voices of Excellence is produced by Doug Dangler. I'm Jen Farmer.